Welcome to Never Mind the Dam Busters, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into the rich, complex and often controversial history of RAF Bomber Command. I'm Jane Gulliford-Lowes, and alongside my co-host James Jeffries, we explore the stories, strategies and remarkable individuals who helped shape this vital part of the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. This week, we're going to be tackling some of your questions, and we've had some absolute belters. We did mean to do this absolutely ages ago, but we've just had so many great guests that sort of fell by the wayside a little. So how's things, James, and what's going on in your world?
Well, hello everybody again. I've just got back today from the RAF Museum in London, RAF Hendon. I did post some things on Blue Sky, a couple of pictures, after a weekend in London, where I also went to the Imperial War Museum on Friday, and I picked up a number of books. I will say I got mostly Fighter Command ones. So I got Squadron Airborne by Elliston Trevor. I got a book about Hurricane versus 110, Spitfire versus 109. But I also got a book called Life and Death in the Battle of Britain. And I mentioned this one because it's about Guy Mayfield, who was the chaplain at Duxford. So it's kind of inspired by our episode from Eleanor. I really want to learn more about their roles. Very, very interesting to read, and I've flicked through it. What else? That's Hendon today. I picked up Mosquito Pathfinder, which is Albert and Ian Smith, a navigator's 90 World War II bomber operations, which, judging by Jane's reaction, she's got a copy of as well.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the shelves. I've got that somewhere.
So that was the other thing. And one thing, actually, I'm going to mention it. I did post online, and your listeners, I'm holding up an Airfix 1/48 scale Bristol Blenheim model, which I couldn't really afford, but I saw it and I absolutely couldn't say no. So I was holding that tight on the underground.
Never mind not affording it. The point is where you're going to put it when it's built.
I have no idea. I will make space somewhere alongside all of these books and such like. But yeah, that was Hannants, which is near RAF Museum. And I keep calling it Hendon. It'll always be Hendon in my mind. RAF Museum London. Really recommend going. They've got a fantastic collection. Other model shops are available, obviously, but today I went there and really, really enjoyed it. Otherwise, I've been very busy marking and lecturing, but I'm nearly there with the marking. And I've got a PhD submission inbound. I've got my final submission date, which is January 2027, which feels like ages, but at the same time, no time at all. I've got 25,000 out of 80,000 words, and it's scattered all over the place. My next chapter is going to be on gender, masculinity, and heroism in the air. So, yeah. I mean, we've covered some stuff with that, and there's plenty there as well. But I have to mention, before I ask you about yourself, Jane, and what you've been up to, the Just Jane episode, we've had some absolutely incredible feedback, haven't we?
Honestly, yeah, the comments that we've had from people all around the world, particularly the responses to the letter that Andrew read out at the very end of the programme from his uncle's crewmate, have been just absolutely fantastic. I must have listened to that about 10 times now through the editing process, etc. And I listened to the full episode last week when it came out as well. And every time I'm just in complete bits. I just cannot hold it together.
Yeah.
Every time I hear it. So, yeah, we really do appreciate the fact that Andrew chose to share that letter with us. It's such an important piece of his family history, and it was just so incredibly moving. And so, yeah, thank you for that, Andrew, and thank you for coming on the show. It was a really, really brilliant episode.
Amazing.
Yeah. So what have I been up to? Well, apart from work in the real world, working very, very hard at the moment, guess what? The book is finally out this week. I cannot believe it.
Yay!
Yay. It's finally going to be out.
Wonderful news.
I can't wait to see it. Really excited. So that's wonderful news. So I'm busy trying to sort of do all the marketing, etc. for that as well. I've just had an invitation to go to the Yorkshire Air Museum next weekend for a commemoration service for Operation Gisela, or Gizella, as the Germans would say, which was probably the last big sort of Luftwaffe attack on RAF airfields and bases, which was early March 1945. So I'm really looking forward to that. And of course, being reunited with my personal Halifax as well at the Yorkshire Air Museum. That would be nice. So it'd be great to see everyone down there, because I've not been for a little while. So that's next weekend. Looking forward to that. What else has happened? all happening on the Norway front, hoping to complete at the beginning of April, finally, on the little house out there. So that's good news. And yeah, just been super, super busy, really, and not had a chance to do any writing at all for absolutely ages. But I'm really, really keen to get back into that as soon as I can, really. So yeah. Right then, shall we move on to our questions? We've got quite a few to get through. Some of these we will be able to answer, some of them we won't be able to answer, and some we might just waffle on aimlessly for about 10 minutes and chew the fat, if you like. But anyway, we've got some absolute belters. Shall I read the first one out and then you can answer it?
Yeah, I just had to say that I was reading through the questions. This is one that I've been prepared for because I've been asked it a couple of times after talks. It's something that's cropped up a few times, and I was quite curious myself. But yeah, Jane, if you want to ask it.
So our first question comes from Rachel Mann. Hi, Rachel. Rachel's a massive supporter of the show, so lovely to hear from her. This was actually sent by email a little while ago, and she didn't want us to sort of ask it in public, but it's such a great question. I think it's one that we really need to deal with. Rachel says,
Definitely.
Can you say more about the complications and challenges of fulfilling aircrew's needs for the loo on a very long round trip on bombing raids? I think I heard you mention that one pilot would get another crew member to mind the shop when he went for a pee. Yes, that's right. I'll come to that in a bit. Rachel continues, I've read that primitive portaloos were available on heavy bombers. Is that true? There must have been even more rudimentary on a Wellington or a Whitley. I can only imagine that these arrangements put crew relationships to the test. You can say that again. Especially if someone had a dicky tummy or a terrible nervous attack to the bowels. Good grief, what a question. Well, hey, these are the realities of the situation. This is the stuff that we're here to talk about. Off you go, James, your special subject.
Absolutely. So this came up, I've mentioned the Augsburg raid again, when I gave a talk on it. And it was like the second question in, because Nettleton, I think, was flying for over 10 hours when he came back. He was the last to land. They thought he was missing because it was so long and all of the rest of 44 Squadron had been lost. And he flew over the Irish Sea. Anyway, it's another story. And the question was, so they were up in the air over 10 hours. They must have needed to go to the loo in that time. But what did they do? And I thought, that's a really, really fair, reasonable question. We'll try to keep this as clean as possible.
Please.
But yeah, the Lancaster, I will, I promise. Most aircraft, certainly the Lancaster, had a toilet on board. Others didn't, especially the earlier ones and such like. And it was the Elson toilet, which was non-flushable. You put tablets in it to kind of erode any certain smells that would be expected from a toilet. But it's not ideal. It's, it's made out of metal, bare skin, high altitude, cold temperatures, and a moving aircraft. It did have a lid on it, but it wasn't particularly reliable.
Thank God for that.
But generally, it's thinking smart about these things. Aircrew would plan ahead. So you'd eat sensibly, easily digestible foods. I mean, that's part of the reason why you have bacon and eggs. It's not high in fibre or anything. They're not there having, I don't know, beans and any sort of like spicy food or anything, particularly beforehand. You'd have boiled sweets for energy, things like that. And obviously don't drink too much. You don't want to be drinking 10 cups of tea before you go, on and op. And you would have tea and cocoa in flasks, but generally you'd say, right, have that later in the flight. Don't have that first thing if you've got an 8-hour flight or anything, because you're going to need the loo at some point. As I say, I mentioned the toilet. You could, and of course, being a man and designed in a certain way that made it easier, do your peeing into a bottle or similar. But again, that's not really ideal because you put it at the side, that's going to potentially smash everywhere and make it very unpleasant, especially with electrical equipment and such like. It could be quite dangerous. And then, this thing being loose on the aircraft. So generally, you would have to have a pee or have a poo in your flight suit. And actually, I've got a story from Jack Curry, who I think is an absolutely fabulous writer and wrote the book on the Augsburg raid that I'm hoping to update, obviously, where his mid-upper gunner asked for permission to go to the loo. He says, Skipper, I really need to go to the loo. And they're over Germany at the time. And Jack replied, because Jack was the pilot, sorry, you're going to have to wait. There's enemy fighters and such like. But on the way home, Jack went, okay, we're safer, we're over the channel and such like, and gave him permission. And the gunner replied and said, I don't think I'll bother now, Skipper. It's gone rock hard. So yeah, you kind of, and if anybody wants the clip or the link to the clip of Jack describing this, it's absolutely hilarious. But yeah, so you would generally, the rule is you would generally try to avoid having lots of liquids, bad foods. You would generally need permission from the skipper. And I think you're going to talk about, if the pilot needed a pee or otherwise, someone could jump in. So I'll hand over to you.
Yeah. So this actually happened with great regularity in my uncle's crew, because the skipper, Reg Pennicott, had a notoriously weak bladder and he used to have to keep going to the loo the whole time, which when you're actually piloting Halifax is not really ideal. However, this crew were fortunate in that their tail gunner, Bill Bradshaw, had actually trained to be a pilot in Canada. He'd actually failed his pilot training, but he still knew the basics and how to handle an aircraft. So when Pennicott needed to go to the loo, he would call Bill up from the tail and they would quickly swap places. And every time he would give Bill the same instruction: just fly it in a bloody straight line. No aerobatics or anything like that. So yeah, so that's what they did. And I'm sure, the flight engineer must have been able to take over on, from a pilot on various occasions, because they are trained to be able to fly the aircraft in an emergency, I imagine. Yeah. But just following on from this, I've just been listening to Roland White's audiobook, Into the Black, about the space shuttle and the early days of the space program and stuff. And this is something which occurred to me. I mean, how do you have a pee in space, taking into account that there's no gravity? How do you actually get it into the bottle?
Well, yeah. Oh, and actually, one thing I heard about that is sometimes when you see shooting stars, they're from the International Space Station and there's something else burning up in the atmosphere. So you might look up and make a wish at this beautiful brief shooting star, and it could be somebody's, Anyway.
Right. I think we should change the subject now, don't you?
We should move on, shouldn't we? Question number 2, which is, that's a bad one. So we've got a question here from Johnny Bushby by email, and he's put context. I've been researching my grandfather's wartime service in Bomber Command. He served as a navigator and later bomb aimer, initially on 44 Squadron, before moving to 97 Pathfinder Squadron. Duo James Bushby. He served operationally between April 1944 and March 1945, and his aircraft was shot down on an operation over Hamburg on the 21st and 22nd of March. The last Lancaster 97 Squadron to be lost in the war. Good grief. My question is, can you shed any light on what the threshold was for a crew's sortie to be counted as one that contributed towards completion of a tour of duty, i.e. 30, 45, etc.? Looking at the ORBs on operations my grandfather took part in, there were occasions when they were called back to base while still within English shores due to weather, presumably not going to count towards the tour. Occasions where they attempted to bomb a target on multiple runs, but the bombs were hung up. It would seem harsh, but maybe wouldn't count. And also a couple where the bomb aimer gave the order to abort mission whilst over the target. Again, would seem harsh, but maybe not counting. He departed an airfield on 49 occasions on operations, according to the ORBs. So I just want to understand how many would have counted towards his full tour. There are about 6, 7 I have question marks over due to the above sort of situations. I've done many a Google search and can't really find the answer. Wow, absolutely brilliant question. Jane, do you want to jump in here?
That's such a good question. And the answer is there's no exact answer, basically. I'm just going to share with you an extract from Jonathan Faulkner's book, The RAF Bomber Command Operations Manual, which he talks about and explains a little bit about sorties and tours and operations. So he begins. Based on the British Army's combat experience in the First World War, the RAF of the Second World War soon realised that to sustain a bomber offensive over a long period of time, some form of frontline crew rotation would be necessary. First, 200 hours was established by the Air Ministry as the cut-off point, whereafter a bomber crew could be rested at an operational training unit or other flying training establishment. In 1941, the notion of an absolute number of operations constituting a tour of duty came into being. 30 sorties, not exceeding 200 flying hours, was regarded as sufficient for completion of a tour, with a 6-month break from operations at a flying training establishment, followed by a second tour. Pathfinder Force crews committed themselves to a 45 sortie tour. On the medium bomber squadrons of 2 group, however, a tour of daylight operations was set at 20 sorties during the autumn of 42, with few crews actually getting beyond 15. Whether this 20 up limit had been set unofficially at group or squadron level is not known, but it would certainly reflect the high level of casualties experienced at the time by crews flying daylight sorties. So that's a useful starting point. I think in general, the rule was, or the rule of thumb was, that an operation would count towards a tour if it involved flying over enemy territory or enemy-controlled waters. So, for example, if you are flying across the North Sea towards Denmark from islanding operation or whatever, and you only get halfway across, and you have to return due to icing or bad weather or whatever, that's not going to count. If, however, you get as far as the actual area where you were supposed to be laying your mines or whatever, then it would count because you've passed over to enemy-controlled waters. I think that's a good rough guide and a rough way to work it out. So that would explain why some would count. So, for example, if you got over enemy territory but couldn't drop your bombs because they were hung up and you had to come all the way back again, drop them in the sea on the way home, that probably would count. But if you got up and you were just, I don't know, you're flying over the south coast of England and had a technical problem and had to return again, that probably wouldn't. So I think that's a good rule of thumb to work from. Now, with regard to the actual specific length of tours for specific crews, I know that the commanding officer of each squadron did have some discretion here. And there are instances of crews being allowed to finish their tour early. And there are instances of crews volunteering to do a few extra operations. You remember Tom Davidson, who we spoke to in episode 3, very early days of the podcast. Tom and his crew had completed their 30 operations, but their pilot volunteered them for a further 6. So they ended up doing 36 in the end. But with regard to my uncle's crew in particular, so this is 10 Squadron, and this is sort of February, March, early 44, they actually completed only about 25 actual bombing operations. But because they'd been on squadron for so long, they'd been there since May 43. They were the longest serving crew on the squadron for a very long chalk. And the fact that losses on the squadron were particularly heavy during that January, February, early March period, 44, they were actually allowed to finish early. And the way that the commanding officer got round this was that they had actually been seconded to Coastal Command for 3 weeks in sort of February, March time, when they were still at the OTU, and they were doing air-sea sweeps, so basically looking for submarines, doing that sort of thing. So technically they were over enemy waters at that point in time. So they were allowed to include those operations that they'd carried out into their tour. They were also allowed to include mine-laying operations where they hadn't been able to drop their mines and had to return due to bad weather because they'd been over enemy waters or enemy controlled waters, as I've just mentioned. So so there is a little bit of discretion there, but I think that really, really depends on the circumstances of the case and the sort of proclivities of the station commander. In this particular instance, I think they were keen to let this crew finish their tour because the rest of the crews at the base used to call them the lucky crew because they just kept on coming back. And I think because things were so bad in early 44 for this particular squadron and for 4 Group in general, to lose this crew at that stage as they're coming towards the end of their tour, I think would have been a massive blow for the other crews who were just sort of coming through. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were allowed to finish early. But there's lots of different reasons that we can speculate on, but hopefully that helps, Johnny. Anything you want to add to that, James?
No, I think that covers it brilliantly. And I will say for anybody who doesn't own that book, it's an absolute Bible, isn't it, Jane? To pick up and just check things, the way that it's laid out and everything. Very, very useful. And so I very, very much recommend it.
It's the Haynes Manual of RAF Bomber Command, 1939 to 45. And it, honestly, for anyone who's just kind of coming to the subject new or even just wants a general overview, but the amount of technical detail in it as well is absolutely superb. It's such a great book. Highly recommended.
And they also do books for individual aircraft. So I've got the Lancaster, the Wellington, and of course the Bristol Blenheim one. And for those that do like to take that deeper dive, they are so interesting. And if you're reading or writing something, you just want to check something, so useful.
I've got the Halifax
brilliant.
one, and it was my Bible when I was writing my last book. It was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, so good. Yeah. Okay, shall we go on to our next question? This is a good one, which I think we can have some fun with. Gareth Charlton by email sent this question in a while back. Now, I did respond to Gareth privately, but I thought it was a good question to share with our listeners. Gareth says, although I'm interested in World War II history, I'm by no means an expert. I've read a few books, but mostly my knowledge comes from films and TV. I think that's how we all begin, isn't it, really? Gareth says, there's two questions that keep popping into my head about bomber missions. In films, you often see the floor of the bomber, especially around the waist gunners, absolutely awash with spent machine gun casings. Was this really the case? Was there any method of getting rid of them ever used? And what about the poor ball turret guy? He'd be knee-deep in no time. What about fuel loads? Were they calculated based on distance to target, or were the tanks just filled to the brim for maximum flexibility? Finally, I don't know if you're planning an episode, but I really heard about deception missions as part of Operation Overlord, where bombers flew complicated oval patterns whilst dropping chaff. I think that the World War II term for this was window. I'd be excited to learn more about this. God, it's about 3 separate episodes in that question, isn't there?
There is.
So much to
Great question.
About. Yeah. Right.
Questions, yeah.
Do you want to tackle the issue of the spent ammunition?
And I think I can absolutely visualize this from Memphis Belle, where you've got the waist gunners and you see
I was thinking of.
And it's piling up, isn't it? They're blazing away and all this sort of stuff. Well, let's focus here on the Royal Air Force, on Bomber Command. And one of the first thing is you rarely fired your guns because you gave your position away. The biggest thing that gunners were there for was to spot enemy fighters. And the biggest evasion was, you'd say, corkscrew. So make an evasive maneuver with the aircraft to the skipper, to the pilot, to then make that maneuver to escape. You very, very rarely fired guns. You do obviously have exceptions and such, but you just absolutely give your position away. That is the last thing you want to do. You only had, I think it was a couple of minutes worth of ammunition for a rear tail gunner, which is a lot longer than a Spitfire of like 15 seconds or 14.37. Or I could never remember the exact number, but it's about that. But as far as I'm aware, I think, you rarely fired your guns. And I think the cartridges fell out of the turrets. I think that's something I'm going to have to double check. But I don't believe that they piled up in the Lancaster or any other sort of aircraft that we've got. Anything to add to that yourself, Jane?
No, but I think it's important to distinguish between the crews which you see in these sort of films, which are all flying, obviously, American bombers, and the difference between the bombers flying for RAF Bomber Command, because obviously there's no waist gunners. There were experiments done with sort of, well, they weren't called ball gunners, I don't think, but sort of underneath the gunners' positions underneath the aircraft, but very, very few aircraft had those. And obviously Bomber Command are doing the majority, certainly not all, of their operations at night. So the last thing you want to be doing is blazing away with your guns, as you say, and drawing in the attention of night fighters in the darkness. Plus, what you're going to be firing at, unless you've got a night fighter actually in your sights, you're not going to be using up your ammunition. You're not going to be just blazing away into the general darkness in the hope that you're going to hit something, because guess what? You're not. So I think that's quite important to mention. And also the fact that quite a lot of gunners never actually fired their guns. They didn't need to because they didn't have that close combat with the German night fighters. And on many occasions, even if they did, it was over in a matter of seconds. Bearing in mind the speeds that these aircraft are flying at, it's so rapid. It's just so instantaneous that you're absolutely not blazing away like they were in Memphis Belle. I can safely say that. Yeah. Right, shall we move on to the fuel loads? Yeah.
So this is where they calculate based on distance to target, or the tanks just filled to the brim for maximum flexibility. This is the thing. If you had a target closer, you would the idea was to have as many bombs as possible. So you would limit the fuel to make maximum bombs for closer targets, so especially targets sort of like in France or whatever. So when it came to Berlin, it was It is all about weight and what an aircraft can take. So if you're going to Berlin, maximum fuel and fewer bombs. And that would actually be an initial indicator for crews. So the ground crews would go, oh, there's mostly fuel, it's X amount of bombs. Oh my goodness, I think it's going to be Berlin tonight. So that would be the determining factor. It would be at the max of weight able to be carried. But ideally, you're trying to get as many bombs in there as possible, but you are limited. You need that fuel to be able to get there and back. I don't think there's anything else I need to add to that. But Jane, do you have anything?
No, I think that's an absolutely perfect summary. Yeah. Perfect summary. Right, shall we move on to this issue of deception and chaff or window? Yeah, that's been asked about in this question. So, what window was? Yeah.
Yeah, you got the window. You got the little bundles of aluminium strips that would be dropped out, and they'd come up on the German radar as big giant blurs and confusion, whether that's a blip in the equipment or whether that's a mass raid, and you would get a few aircraft to drop in the middle of the sea, and the Germans think, oh, there's going to be a raid heading this direction, etc., etc. Incredibly simple, incredibly brilliant. Used to deadly effect. One of the first times, it might be the first time, someone's probably going to correct me there, the raids on Hamburg in July 1943, and that's one of the reasons why, as well as a number of other things, why it was so successful was the onset of window. Obviously, the Germans did catch on to it, and certainly by June 44 they were, but it still worked, and it was still very useful. And with Overlord, I know we talked about this, that was a while back now we did that, but there was an operation, 617 Squadron, we all mentioned them, and they didn't just bomb dams, they were used in a deceptive operation with ships on the sea as well to reflect radar using chaff, the window. And it's used on many occasions. Sometimes it went wrong as well. Timings had to be absolutely at it, and they used chaff. Window. I keep saying chaff. Window at the time. The infamous Nuremberg raid, 30th of March 1944, and it really didn't fox the Germans. And you have 95 aircraft shot out of the sky, over 100 really, the ones that are written off through damage. So it didn't always work. They did catch on to it later on, but it was used, and it was used over Operation Overlord and D-Day. So, yeah. And I think, to add, Jane.
Yeah, again, going back to my uncle's logbook, he took part in the first operation on Hamburg in July 43. Was it around about the 3rd? I think, and they were one of the first crews to be given a window to use. Because as a wireless operator, it was usually the wireless operator, and sometimes I think the was it the bomb aimer? Basically, whoever else was spare at the time. The flight engineer was obviously usually busy. The navigator was usually busy. Whoever was available at the time was just there, just shoveling sackfuls of this stuff out of the aircraft, really. So yeah, that was early July 43. So there we are. Yeah. That's a really good question. I think we could go into sort of technology and sort of countermeasures. I think we should do an episode on that at some point in time.
I'd love to actually talk about 100 Group and what they did with the countermeasures and such like. I think that'd be absolutely fascinating episode. Anyway, we'll move on to the next question. And this is Eric Parker via Blue Sky. What RAF bomber units were there, and what operations took place outside the European theatre of operations, excluding Tiger Force, although that would be a program on its own? Yeah. Jane, do you want to go first on this one?
I can mention briefly a Bomber Command secondment to Palestine in 1942. So this is the Middle East, and this is supporting operations, well, I guess in North Africa, and attacks on Crete, possibly. 10 Squadron were part of the secondment, and they were out in Palestine for a few months, I think. It must have been around about October 42. I've actually got some photographs from this secondment, which bizarrely, the photographs don't show anything to do with the actual operations which are taking place or the aircraft. It's all just the ground crews in various fancy dress costumes, living it up and having an absolute great time. Yeah. And this is my other uncle, who was the ground crew member on 10 Squadron. He was an armourer, so he was out in Palestine for a few months. His photographs, and they're basically just dressed up as cowboys or in drag or God knows what. It just seemed to be just having a well of a time. But there was a serious intent behind all of this. Yeah, as I say, they were supporting operations in North Africa with bombing. But yeah, there were bomber squadrons, not necessarily chunks of Bomber Command, but there are certainly bomber squadrons operating. For example, you've got bomber squadrons operating out of Italy, out of the airfields at La Foggia. And they took part in some of the mine-laying operations up the Danube in summer of 44. And then, you've got other detachments out in the Far East as well.
Yeah, I would really like to cover this more. It is out of the strict remit of sticking to RAF Bomber Command. We're talking about Bombers Southeast Asia Command, the Blenheims, for example, over there and such like. But I definitely think it's something that is worth talking about and exploring. If anybody would like to, or suggest anybody to talk about this, I'd be very, very interested. Yeah, it's Mediterranean and such like. Generally, we look at the Far East and Japan. It is up to the Americans with the strategic bombing force over Japan, and that's why Tiger Force is going to be a factor, but doesn't come to fruition because the war ends. But this is the other thing to separate is it part of a tactical air force? Is it part of a strategic bombing force, et cetera, et cetera? And generally outside for the Royal Air Force, outside of Europe, it's not, So that's the other thing really to consider here. But yeah, it's definitely something I really, really want to cover this.
Yeah, I think we could possibly devote an episode to that as well. All these great questions are all giving us ideas for other episodes. Right, our next question comes from Andrew Manning via Blue Sky. And Andrew asks, how was an individual's role in Bomber Command decided? I had a talent for maths as a teenager, and I have a nasty feeling that I would have ended up as a navigator, almost definitely, and being permanently terrified of getting us lost. Shall I tackle this one?
Yeah, go for it.
Right, so when you volunteered for Bomber Command, and remember, all of these men were volunteers, you would be sent off for initial assessment and sort of various tests to assess your aptitude for the various different roles that were available to you. And this was called, was it PNB training? Pilot, Navigator, Bomb Aimer training. And it would, or rather assessment rather than training. And you would do various sort of cognitive tests, maths tests, that sort of thing, to decide what your aptitude actually was. If you were a grammar school boy, there's a fairly good chance that you would be training as a pilot, as a navigator, or as a bomb aimer. If you just went to technical school, or if you were, shall we say, a bit more working class, there's a fair chance that you would be given one of the other trades. You can almost divide the roles in a bomber crew up into professions and trades. So the professions would be seen as pilot, navigator, bomb aimer, and the more tradesman-like roles, if you like, would be flight engineer, wireless operator, and of course up to two gunners. And that's generally how it was worked out. It wasn't always the case, of course. As I've mentioned earlier, Bill Bradshaw, who was a tail gunner, had done his pilot training initially, but wasn't suitable. He just didn't take to it. And he decided he would retrain as a tail gunner because he wanted to get into the thick of the action straight away. He was offered the chance to go for navigator and he said no. He turned it down. So whereas Jack, who was a working class young man from a mining family in the northeast of England, he trained as a joiner. He was doing an apprenticeship and he was considered to be more of a tradesman, and he was sent off to do wireless operator training. So there was that kind of slight, I would say almost a class distinction. Yes, it wasn't set in stone. You've got many, many examples of people from working class, trade-related backgrounds or whatever, coming and doing pilot, navigator, bomb aimer, whatever. Ultimately, it was all decided on aptitude. How could you best fit into Bomber Command? What would your particular talents be? Remember, lots of the flight engineers were men who were a bit older, like George Phillipson in the Pennycock crew, who had come from working in heavy industry. And again, that's how Tom Davidson got into it as well. He was a flight engineer. He'd been working in heavy industry up at Railroads in Gateshead. Because for a flight engineer, wanted men with the practical skills to be able to fix anything that went wrong on the aircraft during the course of the operation. So you basically had to be able to turn your hands to do anything. So engineers who'd worked in sort of the car industry, aviation industry, ship industry, anything like that, you were an absolute godsend, and their skills were really, really valued. But I think it's important that we emphasise that no role was more important than the other, because none of these aircraft could have achieved what they did achieve, or could have even flown without all of the men on board, without the 7 the heavy bombers had. Every role on that aircraft was absolutely crucial, and the life of the other 6 men depended on you being able to do your job and fulfill your role to the best of your training and the best of your ability. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah. That's perfect. And actually, you just reminded me of the film Journey Together, which I know I've mentioned it before, with Jack Watling and Richard Attenborough. Incredible. It covers this, and they're both trained to be pilots. Jack gets it, but Richard's character doesn't. But the message is, and especially in modern war with the nature of how bombers work, every role is important. I don't want to give the plot away, but I really recommend watching it if you haven't seen it. Obviously, there's a propaganda element to it and such like, but it is still a really, really true message. And you see the process of them training and picking their roles. And one thing, actually, just reading the question was, I think I know I've done it, and a lot of people have done it. You go, what would I have done? Where would I have been picked? And I remember I wanted to be a pilot when I was, knee-high to a grasshopper and all the rest of it. And maths, I was terrible at maths. And someone said, you have to be good at maths to be a pilot and be a navigator. I was like, well, I'm not going to be aircrew, and being very, very disappointed. But like you say, that there were other really crucial, important roles, not just in the air, but on the ground as well. And we got to remember that it's not just the crew in the aircraft, it's the crew on the ground as well, whether that's the intelligence officers, the armourers, etc., etc. You needed to have that skill and that ability and that sense of being a team player to make it work. But yeah, we've all been there, I think, thinking, what would I have done?
Yeah. Well, had I been a bloke, which obviously I'm not, and had I been around in the early 90s, obviously I would have liked to have been a pilot. But I also think that I would actually have been interested in being an engineer, because I'm quite interested in the sort of scientific and how things work and what have you. Yeah, the math stuff would be straight out the window. Yeah, no navigation or bombing for me. No. No.
Same.
Yeah, I'm a
my
words,
eyesight's
numbers kind of girl, but yeah.
Yeah, my eyesight's not great, so I couldn't have been out of a pilot. I'm really, in fact, I don't think I would have been up to the task of actually doing anything on a bomber. But I don't laugh, Jane, but I like the idea of being in intelligence. I think that would have been very interesting.
I do as well, actually. Yeah, I could quite fancy myself being a waff in intelligence, poring over all those photographs and maps and stuff.
Yeah.
My street.
Okay, so we've got the next question here, which is from Doo-Wop on Blue Sky. And it reads, I have read that Bomber Command had a higher loss rate than the USAAF, despite bombing primarily at night. What were the reasons for this? Did Bomber Command ever go to mostly all daytime raids into Germany? I'm guessing this is from an American listener.
I'm not sure. Possibly. Well, initially, the first explanation was because that Bomber Command were fighting the war for about 2.5 years before the Americans joined in, and sustained quite a lot of very heavy losses during that period. But yeah, thanks for getting there eventually, guys. That's going to give me some stick, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, the 41-45 war. Yeah. Just teasing. Couldn't have done it without you guys, that's for sure.
Absolutely.
So I think there's all sorts of really, really complicated reasons for this, to do with things like when the majority of operations took place, and the fact that obviously the Americans are doing mainly daytime raids, but again, not exclusively. They have generally got fighter escorts, which the RAF Bomber Command didn't tend to have. That's just one reason. I think flying at night as well, you've got navigational difficulties. You've got no idea where you actually are. You can't see where you're going unless there's full moonlight, and even then it's a lot more difficult. And I think that the scope for things to go wrong navigationally are so much greater at night than they are during the day. So I think that's another factor, certainly. What about you, James? What do you think on this one?
Yeah, this is just the thing with loss rate, as well as you've got you've got a number of years really to take this in. We looked at the Victoria Cross episode with the ferry battle squadrons flying in daylight, unescorted in May 1940. You can guarantee that you probably weren't coming back. You can look at other periods in the war. So we're looking at the winter of 43 into 44, the phenomenally heavy losses over the Battle of Berlin, is another factor where the percentages would have been higher. But equally, then you've got periods where they would have been slightly lower. So initially, when the RAF fly at night, beginning of 1940, etc., they're probably quite low because the Luftwaffe don't have the night defences in the manner that they did a few years later. The same really goes with the USAAF as well, and it depends on how deep they were flying into Germany at what stage in the war. So it did fluctuate, and I think a big factor, as you said, Jane, is that there is these 2.5 years as well that are a factor here in how active they are operating. So it's one of these things you can read almost anything from statistics. You've got to really dive into them to get a wider picture of what's happening. So you can say, oh, they were higher for USAAF or higher for the RAF. It depends where you're looking at, from what perspective. And especially if you look at it from a whole, that really doesn't tell everything. You've got to dive in there and look at the different periods and what sort of aircraft you were flying as well.
Yeah.
The developments that were happening, how advanced the enemy were, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I was sort of conscious of this when I was watching Masters of the Air, because the losses that were being portrayed in that sort of phase, which again I think was summer 43 into early 44. The Americans took some horrific losses during the daytimes, during the day raids, absolutely horrific. So I don't think you can generalize. There isn't a general explanation for the differences. I don't think it's very nuanced, and there are so many factors. Typical lawyer's answer is it depends. I would say.
It depends. And that's a great example of Masters of the Air. You had the Regensburg-Schweinfurt raid, which is horrendous, the losses that they suffer. But part of that is because they don't have the fuller skill the whole way. It's a pretty rubbish plan, in all honesty, that goes wrong with the fog in England, etc., etc. Slightly before that, the RAF have actually not been suffering too many losses at night. And the Battle of the Ruhr, near the end, the losses start rising. But then by the Battle of Berlin into early 44, you don't want to be in a Lancaster at night. The losses are colossal. But on the flip side of that, you've had Bigwig, Operation Argument. You've got the long-range fighters now. The losses are going down with the American bombers. It's completely changed. So it is a nature of the twists and turns. The technology, as I said, again, the technology the Luftwaffe have, the defences, and how stretched the day fighter force is, the night fighter force, etc., etc. All of these factors come into play. So, lots of things to think about, really.
Even going back to the Battle of Britain, I mean, look at the Bomber Command losses in the Battle of Britain. I know we touched on that in one of our early episodes. I mean, they were massive. There was more Bomber Command crews killed than Fighter Command crewmen. Yeah. And that never, ever gets mentioned, never gets talked about. So, I think it's a very, very nuanced question, and there are many, many explanations for that. But, it's a really, really good question. So thanks for sending that one in, Joe. Thank you.
Yeah, that was absolutely brilliant. I think we're probably going to have to wind things up looking at the time. And gosh, what absolutely fantastic questions, as you say. I think coming up next, we got Sarah Louise Miller coming back, talking about Operation Manna and Operation Exodus. So we got 80 years since they took place. Time to take a little bit of a deeper look into that. Jane, anything else from you?
We're also going to be talking to Håkon Vinje, who's the head of the Norwegian War Graves Service, and he's going to be telling us the story of some of the Bomber Command crewmen who lie in his care, the care of his organisation, in Norway. So, for example, some of the crews who were lost on the raids against the Tirpitz, we're going to be talking about them. But he's also going to be sharing stories about Bomber Command crewmen who were Norwegian, of which there were quite a lot, believe it or not. And again, brilliant. Something which never gets talked about. And so he's got some absolutely fantastic stories that he's going to be sharing with us as well. So really looking forward to that one. So a massive thank you to our audience all around the world for tuning in, especially our new listeners from Auckland, New Zealand, Espoo in Finland, Singapore and Mexico City. We now have regular listeners in over 104 countries. Isn't that absolutely incredible? So if you're enjoying the show, we'd love for you to leave us a review or a star rating on your favourite podcast platform. It is a huge help in connecting other like-minded history enthusiasts with the show. If you want early access to episodes, live streams and exclusive Q&A sessions, you can support the show for just £2.40 or $3 per month. Simply follow the link in the show notes or visit nevermindthedambusters.buzzsprout.com. You can also join the conversation in our Facebook discussion group and follow us on social media. If you'd like to reach out, just send us a message at the top of the show notes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you all again next week. Bye.